You vintage stereo collectors. This is Across the Dial. Some people ask me, why don't you appear in your videos? Well, my hands do. I'm a guy that likes his privacy. I'm also getting a little bit older. I have gray hair, a little bit of a tummy on me. And it's about the equipment. It's not about me. And this is one of these orphan, lost and lonely stereo amplifiers from the late 60s. It's a Claricon, which is a brand. They only had a few models. And I'm not even sure who made these, except it bears some resemblance cosmetically to Lafayette, but the circuitry inside is quite a bit different. It uses these modular boards, kind of like a Kenwood or Sony of the period, but it looks to me almost like Nico. Anyway, tell you a little bit about it. This is a 36-125. It's about 12 watts per channel. It's nicely built, has a nice thick aluminum faceplate. The aluminum knobs are machined. There aren't plastic inserts. They're machined aluminum. Nice little bit of weight to them. So I took this off, cleaned it, cleaned the switches. The volume control that was in this was like, even after spraying it and cleaning it, I could not get it quiet. So I replaced that with another vintage one. But let's talk about the circuitry on this one. This is what's interesting. This one I got very cheap for 20 bucks. I think they should have given me 20 to take it, because it's taken a lot of work. And I'll just show you here, I'm into it for quite a few parts. Filter caps, electrolytic caps, almost all the transistors, several resistors. And I plug this in. I don't use a variac because I'm replacing all the electrolytic capacitors anyway, and you can't reform them when they're this age. This is late 60s, so we're getting up, it's 50 years old. This thing here, it made sound, but it was all bad. It was humming, crackling, and whistling, but it actually would pass the signal, so that was a good sign. I'll show you a little bit about the circuitry inside. I was swinging around here. Sun's starting to come into my office here. This is has a modular power amp section, and these two little transformers here, they are not output transformers, they are interstage phase plane transformers. So you have a driver transistor drives this little transformer here, which splits the phase and drives the outputs, which are quasi-complementary PNP germanium in a TO3 case. And two Sanyo 407s original, and here I noticed they put in some ECG 121s, which are very similar. I went through this board, I took this whole cage apart, took a bit of unsoldering, and there's no schematic. I couldn't find a schematic for this thing. Closest was a 36350, and it had some of the circuitry was the same. This is a stereo receiver made by Claricon. It's got my notes where things were when I unsoldered them. So I went through this, changed all the electrolytics. There are two potentiometers on here. I thought they might be bias, but they are actually not bias for the final, but bias for the pre-drivers, which is kind of interesting. And as usual, these little onboard potentiometers, they're very rough. Couldn't really clean them up, so I put two sealed ones in here, 220Ks. And so got that, cleaned up all the soldering, and these boards are a mess to work with. They're the kind that solders float on the entire trace, and that's to hold it together. It's basically a phenolic board with the equivalent of cigarette foil on it for a trace. Very, very fragile. Even with a 20 watt or 15 watt iron, the traces lift up. And I've repaired this wherever it was bad. And what will happen is you lift the trace and it'll break off. So you put the lead of the new component in, leave it extra long, bend it down, and float with solder onto the trace. And it works. And some of these places here, the trace was entirely gone. Somebody replaced a couple transistors. So I made a new trace just out of the leads from the components. It works, it'll hold. And then there's always crazy glue. Now the sun's coming in here. This preamp board was the worst. Somebody had changed all 4 transistors, and there are these little germanium signal transistors like this. 2SB 405s. It was a real mix. There were 128s. These transistors get so noisy, it's unbelievable. But anyway, I changed all the electrolytics on here, changed them all on here. This here is the tone control board. It doesn't have any electrolytics on it. Put the new volume control into it and turned it on. It was passing signal, but still pretty noisy. I'm going, okay, now what is replace transistor time? So here's the thing. Germanium transistors, don't waste your time putting germanium back in. Convert it to silicon, and it's easy. Japanese amps, and this is why I think this is made by Nico or Kenwood. It's a self-biasing, balanced bias circuit. And so basically, a transistor that's anywhere in the operating range will work. So these are two N3906s, and you can check the bias voltage once you got the circuit up and running. Should be about 0.6 volts. These all locked right in around 0.64, and they had been at 0.17 with the germanium transistors. So the self-biasing circuit works. And many of them, it was torturous unsoldering what was there and putting new ones in. But I did this board, turned it on, got quieter. I've done this board up to this point. So 2 stages, so 1, 2 on this one, 2 on this one. And it's very quiet now, sounding pretty good. And I may change the pre-drivers, but everything's working well. The output transistors are working well. It's fairly quiet. I had some 1-watt carbon resistors that were basically the bias network for the outputs. They had really drifted off in value. So I changed those, put in metal film 2 watts. And as you can see, I got new filter here. There was a 2200 can, which I replaced with a terminal board. Don't even spending the money on the can capacitors. Keep the old ones if somebody wants to put it back in. New diodes instead of the old ones. New snubber capacitors. New AC cord. A lot of solder touching up. I mean, I got about 6 hours into this one, and that's really, I fly through them. But it's actually working and sounding fairly decent now. So anyway, what I'll do is I'll do a demo. I'm going to make sure the bias and everything's correct on the outputs, and do a demo later on. Thanks for watching and listening.